Our time for all ages this morning. As you know, I am preaching on certain Sundays, and I'm not going to be with you next Sunday. And even though that is the Sunday before Thanksgiving, I've decided that I really want to talk about Thanksgiving today, and some of the myths and stories that we may have grown up with, and some of the ways that we may need to take a new look at this holiday. So even though it's a little bit early, I'm sure our thoughts are turning towards the Thanksgiving feast anyway, and this will give you some time to mull over some of these things before it's time to enjoy your turkey and your pumpkin pie. So the first thing to say is that 1621 was the year of the meal that was shared that became mythologized as the first Thanksgiving. So here we are in 2021, and if you do the math, 400 years later, right? So it's a very big deal, and this is a great year to think a little bit and to reconsider Thanksgiving. So with the help of my friend Perry Ground, and also with the help of that I'll show you, that is called 1621, A New Look at Thanksgiving. I have put together some Thanksgiving questions for you. It doesn't really have to be a test. It can be more like a game. And I want to ask you these questions about the myth of Thanksgiving. That's a hint. It's about a myth, right? So these are going to be true or false questions, but they all have the same answer, and it's a myth, okay? So I bet you'll all get them right. Okay, first question. The first Thanksgiving in North America was held in Massachusetts in 1621. True or false? False. So there was a meal in Massachusetts in 1621 that was shared by Europeans and Indigenous people. But that was far from the first Thanksgiving in North America. Do you know that Indigenous cultures have Thanksgiving at the very center of their lifestyle and culture? So the practice of giving thanks and offering gratitude for what you have was kind of baked right into their lives and their cultures. And they had many, many festivals throughout the year for the giving of thanks, as well as each time that they shared a meal. So certainly not the first instance of giving thanks. Number two, the Pilgrims were religious separatists who were seeking religious freedom. True or false? False! Okay, you know your history. So the Pilgrims, who were later called the Pilgrims, right? That was a term that was applied later. They were actually coming from the Netherlands, or Holland, as you may know it. So they were English separatists who had gone to Holland because they wanted to practice religious freedom. So they already had religious freedom where they were living, because the nation of the Netherlands was very, very open to people of all religious backgrounds. What they didn't have, does anybody know what they were seeking? That's right, they were seeking land and wealth. So they were not able to move ahead economically in Dutch society. And so they were seeking a big piece of property, and they were seeking greater wealth. So, number 3, the Pilgrims planned, whew, that's a big pop here. The Pilgrims planned to establish a colony in what is now Massachusetts. True or false? False. Oh, you're so good. That is false. They were actually heading towards what is now New York. So they sort of got messed up and the winds blew them somewhere else. We know these stories, right? And they ended up in what is now Massachusetts. The place the Pilgrims first landed in the New World, was Plymouth Rock. False. Very good. It was indeed not Plymouth Rock. It was not the place that later became Plymouth Colony. Actually, where they first landed was part of the arm of Cape Cod. And then they later moved to the colony that they founded and called Plymouth. The indigenous people that they met had never encountered Europeans before. False, false. There were European trappers and traders through the area, both French, English, perhaps other nationalities, and they had actually suffered in 1617 to 18 a terrible communicative disease, which we're not quite sure what it was, but it actually wiped out a lot of the indigenous people of that area. And it was probably communicated to them by the Europeans that were coming through the area, bringing some new germs with them. Number 6, the colony that the Pilgrims founded was on empty, unoccupied land. False, false. So the entire area that the Pilgrims sort of ended up colonizing and occupying was the territory, although the indigenous people did not have the same kinds of concepts of ownership of land that we have, that Europeans brought to this continent, but the area that the Pilgrims ended up occupying was the territory, meaning the area where people lived and hunted and fished and grew crops, the territory of the Wampanoag people. And Wampanoag actually means the people of the light. They were known as the people of the light because they lived very far east. And sometimes it's mistranslated as the people of the dawn because they were the first of the indigenous people in the area to receive the sun's light each day. Okay, number 7, Squanto was a chief who learned English to communicate with the settlers. False. Okay, so first of all, his name was Tisquantum, not Squanto. That was a Europeanization of his name, Tisquantum. And he was actually not a political leader of his group, but he was someone who had been captured years earlier by English people when he was just living his life, right? And for fun, or for curiosity's sake, they captured a number of Wampanoag people and brought them back to the British Isles to look at and to be a curiosity. So I'd like just for us all to kind of just imagine what that would be like. You're just living your life, and then suddenly you are kidnapped by this foreign group of people and brought to a place that is unlike anything that you've ever experienced before. So Tisquantum spent a number of years in the British Isles, and so he learned English there, and then finally, after a number of attempts, made it back to his homeland. And so that is why he knew English. And that is a part of the story that has never been a part of our Thanksgiving pageants, right? It's important to remember. Number 8, the meal in 1621 was provided by the colonists, and it featured turkey, yams, and pumpkin pie. False, false. That's right. That's right. So the meal was some of the meal was food grown by the colonists, and they believed that duck was served. Actually, the way that the indigenous people joined the meal is they heard a lot of gunshots nearby, and they decided we'd better check this out. We've got a peace treaty with these people, but we don't quite trust them, and we're hearing these guns going off, and we'd better go check it out. So they checked it out, and it turned out that the colonists were doing some hunting of waterfowl, which we believe was duck. So they were serving a meal, and they were serving a meal that was in connection with the harvest and their gratitude for making it through the winter, making it through the previous winter and making it through to a successful harvest in the fall. So while they hadn't thought to invite the indigenous folks that were living in the area, once they showed up, hospitality required that they invite them to the feast as well. And the indigenous folks, the Wampanoag, actually went out and got 5 deer to contribute to the feast. So it was that was probably the centerpiece, right, of the feast, was the 5 deer that the indigenous people provided. And otherwise there were some ducks and some things like peas and some of the things that the English had brought over from their culture, and of course corn, which they had been shown how to grow by the Wampanoag. The feast, this is number 9, the feast was a celebration of friendship between the colonists and the Native Americans. False, right? So they weren't really invited. They sort of showed up because they heard the guns going off, and they realized this was a peaceful gathering. And then once they felt a little more comfortable, they actually went back and got their families. So these were warriors that showed up at first, and then they went back and got the rest of the folks and brought them for this feast. Number 10, Thanksgiving was first used as the name of a day of giving thanks for the autumn harvest. That's false too. Yeah, so this feast that we're talking about, the one that happened in 1621, that was not called Thanksgiving. The term Thanksgiving was first used as a national holiday in connection with the slaughter of indigenous people and the successful battle of the colonists against the indigenous folks that they were fighting later on, about 50 years later. So this is part of the reason, and I think it's very important to understand this, that the fact that this term, Thanksgiving, was first used as a religious giving of thanks for winning this battle against the indigenous enemy, quote unquote, is part of the reason why this is a difficult holiday, right? This is a difficult holiday. It wasn't until much, much later that the national holiday of Thanksgiving was declared, and then we sort of went back and created, out of some of these elements that we've talked about today, a story that kind of sounds really heartwarming and beautiful, right? So there are elements of truth about that Thanksgiving story, as you heard today. There are elements, but it's like somebody took the puzzle pieces and kind of shuffled them around a little bit and made it sound a lot better and edited it out, the parts that are a little bit difficult. So that's why history is so important, right? To kind of keep uncovering and keep going back and keep trying to understand. And that is just what the people at Plymouth Plantation and National Geographic have done in this book, 1621, A New Look at Thanksgiving. And they actually recreated, to the best of their ability, the Thanksgiving, the meal. I shouldn't say Thanksgiving. See, it's still embedded in my brain too. The harvest meal that was shared by the settlers and the indigenous people. So if you ever get a chance to look at this book, and I've got 2 copies of it if you're interested, it's really wonderful. It's full of photographs of those recreators that were using primary sources of history, actual writings of people of the time, to understand exactly what happened and recreate it together with the Wampanoag that still live in the area and European descent people as well. So, with that, I invite us into a practice of gratitude and generosity today by offering what we have to this community. You know, it's difficult to let go of the dream of Thanksgiving. It was very difficult for me. It was my favorite holiday for most of my life, and maybe because I wasn't raised as a Christian, and so many of the holidays felt, even though my family celebrated them, they felt like someone else's holiday in a lot of ways. But Thanksgiving seemed so beautiful and inclusive. I loved it because it was for everyone, I thought. I loved that it wasn't about getting presents or candy. It was about being grateful for what you have. It wasn't about getting stuff. It was about enjoying time with family and with friends. It wasn't about being one particular faith. It was about being an American. At least for Americans who look like me, have ancestors that come from the same continent that I come from. For us, it felt inclusive and welcoming. But for others, those who'd been here all along, it felt very different. So here we are on the anniversary of this famous meal that has been celebrated in song and story, celebrated with pageants all over North America, telling stories of dubious truth to our children, maybe our children's children. And as we saw today, the story is full of half-truths and inconsistencies. And I need to really credit my friend Perry Ground, who is a historian and a storyteller and an Onondaga elder, and who has led services at this congregation. He is a person with one foot in the academic world and the culture of Anglo-America, and he's also a full participant in his own culture, culture of his birth and his ancestors, and the Turtle Band of North America. And his take on Thanksgiving, which I find great inspiration in, is this, and I'm paraphrasing what he has said. He says, yes, this holiday has been misrepresented to us, and yes, various leaders have shaped it and reshaped it to suit the needs of the moment and their own political ends. And yes, there was terrible bloodshed and incomprehensible suffering later on in the history of these two groups, the Wampanoag and the Dutch separatists of Plymouth Colony. But the peace they negotiated together did last for 50 years. And the gathering they held, which was not by any stretch of the imagination the first Thanksgiving, not in North America or in England, but it was still this. It was an intercultural gathering in peace and in fellowship. This we can say. It was good food and good company. It was gratitude for survival and for all the blessings of life, even a life lived amidst terrible adversity. So Perry's challenge to us is to abandon those saccharine stories of our youth and to reach out for the complexities of the true story, and to find the good within that real story, just as the reenactors of Plymouth Plantation have done, just as they did when they reached for the truth and held an intercultural gathering in peace and in inclusivity. Not by sweeping the terrible parts under the carpet, but by recognizing that they occurred and mourning them, and also learning from them. And yet, as Perry says, still choosing to celebrate the good. When I took my then 8-year-old son to hear Perry speak about Thanksgiving, which is where I met Perry, he and his best friend, Ben, learned a little bit more about U.S. history. And I hope that they'll be ready to share what they've learned with their classmates and with their teachers, maybe. And whenever it's time for the good old Thanksgiving pageant, there will be a few more kids there to say, hey, you know what? I think we should check the sources because I don't think that's what really happened. Now, what about the food? Well, we've learned that turkey and yams were not on the table at that first celebrated meal in 1621. So does that mean we have to give up these foods on our special day? For a perspective on Thanksgiving foods, I'd like to turn to a chef, Sean Sherman, who is the author of the Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, and that's Sioux spelled S-I-O-U-X, the Sioux Chef Indigenous Kitchen, for which he won the James Beard Award a few years ago. He says this: many of my Indigenous fellows refuse to celebrate Thanksgiving. They protest the whitewashing of the horrors that our ancestors went through, and I don't blame them. But I have not abandoned this holiday. I've just changed how I practice it. He goes on to say, we don't need the poisonous Pilgrims and Indians narrative, and we don't need that illusion of past unity to actually unite people today. Instead, we can focus more simply on values that apply to everybody: togetherness, generosity, and gratitude. And we can make this day about what everybody wants to talk about anyway. No, not football. The food. The food. You see, people may not realize it, but what every person in this country shares, and the very history of this nation, and really the history of this world, has been in front of us the entire time. Most of our Thanksgiving recipes are made with indigenous foods: turkey, corn, beans, pumpkins, maple, wild rice, and the like. We should embrace this. And just as an aside, this is not Sean anymore, this is Kristina. I'd like to add amaranth, quinoa, many varieties of berries, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, many different kinds of beans, many medicinal and nutritional herbs, all come from North and South America. It's hard to imagine world cuisine without tomatoes. It's hard to imagine world cuisine without potatoes. So the influence of indigenous foods, corn, beans, squash, the influence is really mind-boggling when you think about all the foods that this continent has given to the world. So Sean goes on to say, For years, especially as the head of a company that focuses on indigenous foods, I've explored these native foods. It's given me, and can give all of us, a deeper understanding of the land that we live on. No matter where you are in North America, you're on indigenous land. And so on this holiday and on any day, really, I urge people to explore a deeper connection to what are called American foods, by understanding true Native American histories, and begin using what grows naturally all around us, and to support Native American growers. There's no need to make Thanksgiving about a false past. It's so much better when it celebrates the beauty of the present. Now, for a final voice in our exploration of Native American perspectives on Thanksgiving, I want to turn to one of my favorite authors, Potawatomi writer and plant biologist Robin Wall Kimmerer, who lives in upstate New York. For Kimmerer, setting aside just one day to practice gratitude is, in a word, stingy. Living among the Haudenosaunee nations, she expresses appreciation for their traditional Thanksgiving address, which is given at every public gathering throughout the year. In this address, each part of creation is thanked, one by one. Kimmerer proposes that every school child in America be taught the virtues of gratitude by listening to this Thanksgiving address and participating in it on a regular basis. She says, you can't listen to the Thanksgiving address without feeling wealthy. And while expressing gratitude seems innocent enough, it's a revolutionary idea. In a consumer society, contentment is a radical proposition. Contentment is a radical proposition. Recognizing abundance rather than scarcity underscores an economy that thrives by creating unmet desires. Gratitude cultivates an ethic of fullness, but the economy needs emptiness from us. The Thanksgiving address reminds you that you already have everything that you need. This kind of Thanksgiving, Kimmerer writes, reminds us of how the world was meant to be in its original condition. We can compare the roll call of gifts bestowed on us with their current status. Are all the pieces of our ecosystem still here and doing their duty? Is the water still supporting life? Are all the birds still healthy? When we can no longer see the stars at night because of light pollution, the words of the Thanksgiving address should awaken us to our loss and spur us to restorative action. Like the stars themselves, these words can guide us back home. Now, there are many, many other perspectives from Indigenous people written and spoken about Thanksgiving, as many as there are Indigenous people. These are just three that have really shaped my thinking. Now, I plan to enjoy my Thanksgiving meal with my family on an upcoming Thursday, and as I do, I will share these perspectives with the people around me. I invite you to do so as well. I will also continue to educate myself and my son about the true history of the holiday that we have come to call Thanksgiving. I'll celebrate the parts of the story that are beautiful and worthy of appreciation, while not ignoring or whitewashing the true and very disturbing history of Europeans on this continent. I'll practice gratitude and appreciation for the incredible variety of foods that come from North America, and I'll learn more about Indigenous ways to prepare them. Most of all, I will try to find ways to practice gratitude and generosity every day of the year, not just the final Thursday in November. May all of us have the courage and the curiosity to re-examine our histories and our holidays and our national myths with an eye towards the truth. May we learn to listen with respect to the voices of those whose cultures and communities have been decimated, uprooted, marginalized. And may the practice of gratitude lead all of us to appreciate what we have, to find contentment with the true blessings in our lives, and to share our abundance with all who have little every day of the year. Our closing words today were written by, once again, my very favorite author, Robin Wall Kimmerer. She says, "When I close my eyes, I envision people recognizing the dazzling gifts of the world. They will honor at last the giveaway from Mother Earth. Blankets of moss, robes of feathers, baskets of corn and vials of healing herbs, silver salmon, agate beaches, sand dunes, thunderheads and snowdrifts, cords of wood and herds of elk, tulips, potatoes, Luna moths and snow geese, and berries. More than anything, I want to hear a great song of thanks rise on the wind. I think that song might save us." We extinguish the flame of this chalice, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.